In lesson 5.3, we'll use what we know about factoring to help us solve different types of equations. So a quadratic equation in its standard form is an equation in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a, b, and c are real numbers, and a doesn't equal 0, because if a was equal to 0, then we wouldn't have a squared term. We have different names for our three terms here. So the ax squared, that's called our quadratic term. The one with just x, so bx to the first, that's our linear term, and then the constant term, and I'll be referring to those throughout. You can have different forms of equations, but oftentimes we want to put it into this standard form. As we go through the next few lessons, we're going to be using factoring, which we just worked through in lesson 5.2, solving by taking the square root of both sides, completing the square, and then finally the quadratic formula. So those are all going to be ways to solve quadratic equations. So here we go. The zero product property seems pretty obvious, but it's important. If the product of two or more numbers is 0, so if you are multiplying different things together and your answer is 0, at least one of those numbers has to equal 0, because then you take those numbers, multiply it by 0, and it will be 0. In symbols, you could say p times q equals 0. If p times q equals 0, then either p equals 0 or q equals 0. And so we're going to use that concept as we work through many of these quadratic equations. We're going to get some practice with our factoring. So here we go. Solve x squared minus 6x plus 8 equals 0. And so what we want to do is we want to factor this quadratic. It's in the standard form that we want. It's set equal to 0, which is important. We don't have to change anything to it. So we want to see if we can factor x squared minus 6x plus 2. To get an x squared, we know we have to have an x and an x. And to get a positive 8 here, we either need a positive times a positive or a negative times a negative, and we can look over here, and we definitely need a negative times a negative. And then we think that our factors of 8, which are going to be negative 1, negative 8, or negative 2 and negative 4, that we can use in here. And when the coefficient's 1, all we have to do is find the ones that add up to equal this middle number, and negative 2 and negative 4 are the answers to factor that. Now we're going to use this zero product property. We have two things. This is kind of like our P, and this is times Q, is equal to 0. So either P equals 0, so either x minus 2 equals 0, or x minus 4 is equal to 0. A lot of times we'll just end up doing this in our head, but we could add 2 to both sides and we get x equals 2 or x equals 4. We can write our answer just as a combination x equals, and we put 2 comma 4, which means if we put either of these numbers in, put 2 in, 2 squared minus 6 times 2 plus 8, that will equal 0, or we could put 4 in there, and that would still give us 0. So our solutions to that quadratic equation are 2 and 4. Moving on, here's some steps. If necessary, put the equation in standard form, which means all terms are on one side and 0 is on the other side. We'll factor, then apply the zero property, and solve the equations. So here we go. In order to solve this, we want to have it in standard form, so we want all terms on one side with 0 on the other, so we could subtract 2x from both sides here. So that's key. We want to get 0 on one side, and we have 5x squared minus 2x is equal to 0. So we did this first step. Factor. Well, this is only two terms. We see that there's an x in common, so we can factor out an x. And we're left with, after we factor out the x, 5x minus 2. And so now we have two things multiplied together equals 0. So either this first one, so either x equals 0, or 5x minus 2 equals 0. Well, so one of our answers is 0, or we can solve this. We would add 2 to both sides, and then divide both sides by 5. and we get x equals 5/2, and so our answer is 0 or 5/2. And we could plug 0 in, and that would make it work, or we could plug 5/2 in, and that would make it work. Here's another example. Here we have r cubed plus 32r equals 12r squared. Well, this isn't even a quadratic, it's actually a cubic function, but we're going to start by applying the same idea and getting all terms to one side. So we're going to subtract 12r squared from both sides. When we do that, we're going to go ahead and put these terms on the left in descending order. So we have r cubed minus 12r squared plus 32r. And again, this is a cubic function, but we do notice in each term there's an r, so we can factor out an r. We factor out an r, we're left with r squared minus 12r plus 32. Well, now inside the parentheses here, we have a quadratic equation. Make sure we bring this r down. Don't just forget about it. And to get r squared, we need an r and an r. Positive here, so we'll either have a positive and a positive, or a negative and a negative. It's got to be negative because we have this negative 12 here. And we want to think of factors of 32 that will add up to equal negative 12. Since our coefficient out here is 1, we can think of it that way. So 32 is 8 and 4. So we can do 8 and 4. They're both negative, which will give us that 12r there. Now that we're there, we apply the 0 product property. So now we have 3 things that add together to equal 0. So either from this one, r equals 0, r minus 8 equals 0, or r minus 4 equals 0. So either r equals 0, got a little ahead of myself, r equals 0, add 8 together to both sides here, and we get r equals 8, add 4 to both sides, and we get r equals 4. So our answer is r equals 0, 4, or 8. So when we look at this right here, we really could jump to our answer from here as we get better at this. Either r equals 0, we think what value of r makes this 0, and 8. If we put an 8 in there, it would make it 0, so that's the 8. And if we put a 4 in here, that would make this term 0. A couple more here, a couple more examples. This one's going to be another factoring one. Example 5 is a little different. So in example 4, we want to see if we can factor. Well, now this time we have a 2 here, so we have to be a little more careful with our factoring. We got 2x times x will give us that 2x squared. This is a negative here, so we know we're going to need a plus and a minus. These aren't set in stone. We might have to switch the order if this doesn't work out right away. And then 15, our factors of 15 are 1 and 15, or 3 and 5. And so we can start trying those out. We'll put a 3 and a 5. To check those, we got 3x minus 10x gives us negative 7x. So actually that our first guess gets it. So this is factored correctly, and now we can write, we have 2 things multiplied together to equal 0, so either 2x plus 3 equals 0, or x minus 5 equals 0. We can subtract 3 and then divide by 2 over here. Dividing by 2 gives us negative 3/2. And over here we can add 5 to both sides. And we get our other solution of x equals 5. So our answers are x equals negative 3/2, or if you wanted to put negative 1/2, that's fine, and 5. The next example here, write a standard form quadratic equation whose solutions are negative 2/3 and 5. All right, so we want the solutions to be negative 2/3 and 5. What we do here, so we're going to write an equation that's equal to 0. And let's start with the 5 actually. What factor gives us 5 as a solution? Well, we would need x minus 5. We need the opposite of this. So x minus 5, because if we put 5 back in, we would get 0 minus 5 is 0, which equals 0. And then this one, we could think of in two different ways. First, one that involves a fraction, but we can put x and just the opposite of this, plus 2/3. And we can multiply this out. Now, we're the ones writing the equation, so we can fiddle with this a little bit. We don't usually like having fractions in standard form. So if you remember to eliminate fractions, we can multiply by the common denominator. So we're going to go ahead and multiply this equation by 3. And then I'm going to go ahead and get it in quadratic form, something like this. Looks like this in the standard form. So first I'm going to multiply this 3 times both of these. So we have 3x. And then 3 times 2/3, the 3's will cancel, and we'll get plus 2. And that's still multiplied by x times 5. And now we can multiply this out. 3x times x is 3x squared. 3x times negative 5 is negative 15x. 2 times x. And 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. We're saying that equals 0. We got a couple like terms here we can add together, and our answer is 3x squared minus 13x minus 10 is equal to 0.